Greetings and welcome to the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy's election postmortem on election impacts on the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion movement within corporate America. I'm pleased to welcome three esteemed colleagues, guests, and friends. I'm going to ask them all to unmute so that I can introduce the panel, and then we're going to dive right into what I think will be a great and thought-provoking conversation. So we're lucky today. I could spend the entire time of this session introducing our three guests, but since we're here for a power hour, I'm just going to go with the short form intros. We're very lucky to have Christina Greer, who is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University. She's also a very noted, nationally recognized commentator on politics for several media outlets. We also have Thomas Ogorzalek, who is the lead researcher and co-founder of the CoLab Research, and also the founder of the Chicago Democracy Project. And we have Sophia Jordan-Wallace, who is a professor of political science at the University of Washington and one of the country's leading scholars of the Latino experience. So thank you all for joining us today. It's been something of a very interesting election season, and I cannot wait to dive in and hear your takeaways and thoughts in the round robin. Let's just start with a question that I'd like each of you to answer. Starting with Christina, what was your biggest takeaway from the election from the standpoint of the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda?
First, thanks for having us, Al. I think a lot of folks feel as though we held back a tide that we were told was coming. And so I think a lot of folks who believe in this work are taking a victory lap. And sure, I think we can, but I think it should be a short victory lap, because when we look at the margins by which some of these candidates won, especially Democratic incumbents, they did very well, and they were able to hold off some really egregious candidates, people who did not believe in democracy, who did not believe in diversity or inclusion. They're anti-immigrant, anti-choice, they believe in insurrections, they're election deniers. But when we look at the margins by which those Democrats won, it's not like they blew them out of the water. In New York, for example, Governor Kathy Hochul, an incumbent, was running at the top of the ticket for the first time, but she only beat, an election denier, someone who does not believe in immigration or women's right to choose or any of the things that, we believe in and that the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy believes in. He lost to her by only 5%. And this is New York, right? And so this is reminding us of Malcolm X, anything south of the Canadian border is the US South. Because Michigan, great wins, right? Fantastic wins. But this is also a state where, certain people tried to execute and kidnap the sitting governor. So when we look at Arizona and Nevada, building on the work of Stacey Abrams from many years ago, we had Democratic wins, big D Democratic wins, but by very, very slim margins. So I don't think that the folks who are against this type of work are going to go quietly. I do think that they'll have to reorganize themselves, but once they do, they'll figure out certain issues to be successful. I think the Democrats were handed a gift in the Dobbs decision, but had it not been for Dobbs, I don't know if we would have seen young people come out the way they did. I don't know if we would have seen the mobilization that we did among certain women. So I think Democrats had some gains despite themselves, not because of anything great that they were necessarily selling, sadly. And they need to get themselves together because the margins were quite slim.
Interesting. What about you, Tom?
Thanks again. I want to reiterate that note. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. Enjoying this conversation. I think I agree with basically everything that Dr. Greer just said. We shouldn't think of this as a sort of a durable repudiation of everything that the sort of MAGA forces in America stand for, because the nature of the win was kind of small. We might think of it as almost like a stalemate, an endorsement of the status quo or something like that. Incumbents across the country were very successful in retaining office from both parties. But one thing we might be able to say is that the Republican agenda writ large is pretty unpopular. So midterms, there's a long pattern in American history of midterms basically being a mild repudiation of whatever party is in power. And in this case, the Democrats didn't lose very much. So we might even see it as a repudiation of the party that's out of power, the Republican Party. So that's like one of the unusual things that happened in this election. And we can think of this as there's the Republican candidates that lost the most, or the most surprisingly, were kind of the celebrity candidates, people like Herschel Walker, who didn't do as well as probably another candidate, more professional candidate might have done, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, notably. So there might be a break on the sort of Donald Trump aligned celebrity MAGA overthrow the election, overthrow the government thing, but all the other sort of other really polarizing elements of the actual political agenda in the country are kind of still there. And one place we could see that is the gains made in Florida by the Republican Party, where Ron DeSantis leads that Republican Party in the state. And his agenda isn't to overthrow the election, but it is sort of explicitly an anti-DEI agenda. He famously passed the quote unquote Stop Woke Act. He goes out and he has picked fights with many major corporations within Florida, which is very unusual for a governor to pick fights with some of the state's biggest employers. He's gone out and done that explicitly on the basis of DEI and just social justice agenda. So this is one thing that we might see continue, especially as commentators put him forth as a possible future leader of the Republican Party, if there's sort of a post-Trump era that's about to come. So that's one thing that DEI advocates might want to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Wow, that's great. Thanks, Tom. How about you, Sophia?
Yeah, thanks so much, Al, for having me on this panel, and I'm excited for this conversation. I agree with much of what's said. I will say, though, that I do think the margins were pretty slim. I think in certain places, Democrats did way outperform. If we look at what were the kind of Republican margins in those places going back to the last election, those are actually pretty considerable margins when we think about, for example, how much did the governor of Arizona, when he ran and was Republican, what did he win by? And now, yes, Hobbs hasn't won by very much, but it's a pretty significant difference because he won by plus 15 points in the last election. So I think part of what we have a kind of impulse to do is generalize to the whole country, but much of what we're learning is actually we have to think about specific groups and specific geographies, and even think about specific elements of specific groups, right? To really understand and think about what's happened. I think one thing we definitely know, and I want to highlight this from Christina's points, is that I think here we know that voters of color, youth showed up, but also specifically women of color have very specific voting patterns on average that is heavily favorable to Democrats and is a key constituency in terms of what we saw happen in this election. I think that 100% abortion politics was a lot more salient than a lot of people thought it might be. I think even some Democrats were hopeful that it would be a salient issue. They weren't sure if it would be. I think a lot of Republicans, strategists were in denial about how much it would be a mobilizing issue. I think we have confirmation at this point, given some exit poll data, that it certainly was mobilizing. And I do agree with Tom that I think extreme candidates who really went deep into election denial were the most anti-choice, most anti-LGBTQ, and anti-immigrant. I do think we see some rejection of those candidates by people who would have otherwise been likely Republican voters. But we don't actually know if those people will once again cross, the partisan line and vote for a Democrat. If, for example, more Republican moderate candidates emerge. In fact, I would suggest that probably they'll go back to voting for Republicans. So this doesn't necessarily tell us, hey, there's a big shift towards democratic values, and policies, as so much as some segment of who Republicans have relied upon to win elections felt deeply uncomfortable with some extremism. But that doesn't mean that they're going to wide scale endorse all types of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, type of policies, rhetoric. I think we need to be very careful about assuming that. But it is clear that for a segment of the population that feels really strongly that these types of candidates are just an anathema to American values, I think for that segment of the public, they do feel really strongly with justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And I think that's really important for us, particularly when we think about the size of youth voters mobilizing and what will be the role of Gen Z and how diverse Gen Z is relative to other generations. I think it's important to think about what does this mean in terms of coming elections.
Yeah, no, it's profound. So before we move on to the second question, you all sort of touched on something that I want to sort of surface and have you all come. So it sounds like what I'm hearing from you all is that Republican underperformance, Democratic overperformance in some regards, and then the kind of regional variation is really important for us all to take note of. What about turnout? Like, do you believe that Democratic turnout, particularly among the young populations that Sophia was just spotlighting, do we have a sense yet of its unevenness or where it was regionally, that we can say, maybe if this is a presidential year, the JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda would look more robust, right? If this were a presidential election. So where was turnout for the groups that support the JEDI work? Anyone have some feedback on that or no?
Well, just from some of the preliminary data that I saw, it looks like young people and kind of first-time voters skewed democratically. I think it's like 2/3 Democrat to 1/3 Republican. I mean, I always remind people when we saw folks marching on Charlottesville with tiki torches, they weren't over the age of 40. So
Right,
like, you can't just assume that just because you're under 25, you believe in this work at all. And we know that on college campuses, even though, Youngkin and Abbott and DeSantis might try and paint them as these liberal bastions, we know that there are a lot of right-wing extremists being recruited on college campuses, not just in the armed services and police departments. So I think we have to pay attention there. I also, and I've been criticizing Jamie Harrison but I think, there's a lot of money spent in Washington, D.C. with very wealthy campaign folks that aren't interested in tapping into young people and meeting them where they are. And so, we saw the last week of the election, Obama's doing something on TikTok. But, it has to be a sustained conversation with these young voters. They are on social media in ways that we never were and probably never will be, just because we're over a certain age. And we're born in a particular, I was born in the 1900s. So, what do I know about all these motivations? But I do think that this generation is not going to be, like a lot of Black women, as Sophia mentioned, we're the canaries in the mine. We're the ones who overperform at the ballot box. We're the ones who are the soul and conscience of this nation. We're warning people constantly of what's ahead. But I think that young people will not take kindly to just being talked to every 2 weeks before an election. They demand a certain type of attention, as they should, a type of political attention to their needs and their wants. And I think, the Democrats have an agenda that seamlessly fits into what a lot of young people are interested in, not just a woman's right to choose. And that's women and men who are interested in that, because that's a financial conversation for both parties. But they're interested in climate change. They're interested in a conversation about school debt, even those who aren't in college as much, because they understand the economic ramifications. And then I think we all know, as political scientists, people go to the polls for economic issues, but it's not just about gas prices and grocery prices. It is about a larger economic future that I think a lot of Gen Zers, they're like, we're broke. Our parents are broke. Like, their idea of what success looks like and how you make it in this country is a little different than our understanding and expectation. And they're going to demand something differently that I think the party, the Democratic Party specifically, is more teed up to address. It's just they have to work within some structural constraints that Sophia and Tom both mentioned. If you take a place like Florida, because of gerrymandering, because of redrawing districts, it will be harder for these young people's voices to be heard and to be counted.
Yeah, no, that's great. Anybody else want to weigh in on the turnout issue? Or
Sure, I could say a couple more things. First of all, as we do these postmortems, the numbers are still coming in. They're still literally counting votes in California. So take every number we say with a grain of salt, but I think most of our insights will probably hold up for everybody who's speaking here today. One thing we can say, based on the preliminary numbers from folks like Circle at Tufts University, which is a great resource for understanding youth voting, is that majority—
My alma mater.
Oh yeah, all right, pachyderms. The youth vote in terms of turnout was relatively high relative to recent elections, but still lower than most other age groups. So if we were to break it down and say folks under 30, those are the Gen Z, that's kind of the way that the analysts are kind of breaking it up. The voter turnout is sort of the last two cycles have been record highs for midterms in that group, but they're still 10 to 15 points lower than most of the other age groups. So there's a lot of mobilization work to get done, a lot of sort of engagement of this group, which is alienated from both of the political parties to a great extent, and wants to find its place in politics. So it needs political leadership to speak to it a little bit more. The other thing we can say is that it does look like while not every Gen Z has voted for Democrats, majorities in each major ethnic, racial and ethnic group do seem to have voted for Democrats in this cycle. So it's the only age group of white Americans to vote majority for Democrats is under 30. So about 58% of white voters under 30 supported Democratic candidates in this cycle, including in some perhaps surprising places. So in Florida, the white youth vote was majority Democratic. In Ohio, the white youth vote was a majority Democratic in those Senate races or governor races. So these are interesting like glimpses of the future, even in the purple or reddish places that we might not expect.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Sophia?
I just want to add one more thing about this is I think it's prudent for both parties to be really cognizant of both the potential impact of youth voters, but also that their perspective, as Christina mentioned, on issues is also different, because when they think about things like what's happening with climate change, they're thinking about that from this perspective of, say, a person who's 21 years old and has many years left to live, and is thinking about that, right? That's very different from a person who's currently 75 or 80 years old, right? In terms of what's your calculation of how are the things we are going to do now and some of the policies we might be willing to implement now are going to pay dividends in the future, then I'm still going to be alive. I think that there's a level to which we are going to see increasingly in opinion data amongst youth, and as Tom mentioned, across racial and ethnic groups, that a lot of these really extreme policies that are truly aimed at marginalization of specific groups are just not popular with a lot of youth. They're just very unpopular. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's very unpopular. I do think it will be important, though, for parties to convince youth that it's worth participating and that they actually are offering some type of real policy solutions and not just trying to get people's votes, but they're actually offering a vision to imagine progress on these different issues. Because I think it can be easy to be pretty, honestly nihilistic, given the current situation in the United States, but also thinking forward on some of these issues and some of the like anti-democratic impulses. People have to decide it's worth participating, and parties need to do that work, and they need to offer that vision. And I think it does require sustained engagement. And as Christina said, meeting them where they are, sustained engagement, and what GOTV looks like at a generation that uses technologies that are really different than other generations is really going to be quite different. If parties don't adjust, that will result in diminishing their voices of the youth, but also, potentially failure to win elections that they could get support for. And I think it's important for them to pivot. And unfortunately, it's not about learning, okay, now in the next election, we're going to use these two apps and that's going to work, because the thing with technology is it's constantly shifting and changing. So what were the apps 5 years ago is really different than how you would mobilize now, really reaching out to those groups. And so I think it will kind of involve an investment in continuously figuring out, how do we reach youth voters? What are the platforms that they're using? What does it mean to meet them where they are? And that is really different than, here's a way that we figured out GOTV works with a bunch of different groups of voters, and we're going to then employ that over and over and over again. So it kind of involves more creativity and constant relearning and reassessing and readjusting on what's going to work. But I think it is really important, and thinking about corporations, these are future workers. These are the people who are going to be they're trying to employ. So it's really important for all of us to really understand, where are young people at in their thinking of what they want and what they're hoping to see government and organizations and workplaces employ.
No, that's great. And it's also a great bridge to the next question. Tom said something about the anti-woke bill, the Don't Say Gay bill that was passed in Florida. Tom and I, full disclosure, spent a lot of last year together building a DEI consultancy. Also full disclosure, we're going to relaunch in Q1 of next year, a new venture together. And so I know he's got his pulse on what corporations are thinking about. And so Tom, if the question is how should corporate leaders interpret the results of the election from a JEDI standpoint, I think some of the corporate leaders that you and I were talking about were getting a little jittery about, how much further they could go with these programs, given, DeSantis's really just odd behavior in the Disney example, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to punish Disney by, I guess, canceling their debt. I mean, I guess that's a punishment, right? But just the kind of rhetoric was so, vituperative toward a major American employer, let alone the largest employer in Florida. And it's like, so, that's the one place where that politics seemed to win. But when you fan out throughout the rest of the country, it seems like, there's a repudiation, even if it's a narrow one, as Christy and Sophia pointed out, there's a repudiation of, the kind of direct hostility toward the LGBT and racial justice movements. And so am I right about that? Or should companies still be worried about where we're going and how they're going to be targeted if they try to move boldly in the JEDI space?
Yeah, that's a really good point and a good question. And I think so part of the challenge that we'll face in the next couple of years is that the one thing that did change at the national level institutionally is that it looks like the Republicans are going to take over the House of Representatives and they'll have some powers to run that chamber. Now, because of the way that power is distributed across the institutions, the checks and balances, they won't be able to pass any laws by themselves. And also they don't seem to have much of a national agenda. They don't have like a platform written down other than we like Donald Trump. That was literally their platform in the last election. But one thing we do know is that they'll probably turn to something like investigations of some kind, and they might try to drum up attention in the media around any number of a range of grievance issues. So wait and see whether they talk about Hunter Biden, or maybe they'll start to talk about, I don't know, trans athletes or something like that in order to gain attention or draw attention to something that's not really a real issue or not like a real threat to American society in any kind of way that they're going to talk about. So that's one thing that I would kind of keep my eye on. But on in the long run or in the medium run, one thing that happened, not in the election itself, but what happened this week is that might be kind of help shape our expectations about the future for JEDI work is in Virginia, in the last gubernatorial election. You might remember from last year, there was a gubernatorial election there and Glenn Youngkin ran, and critical race theory in education was one of the main issues that got drummed up in the over the course of the election.
Yeah.
And in response to that, they set up a hotline where parents or others could call in and say like, oh, my teacher's teaching critical race theory and it's making my student uncomfortable or something like that. Well, that hotline was shut down because they got literally no complaints over the last year. And hotline was shut down last week. So it kind of reveals or indicates that that the public knows that a lot of these kinds of sort of alarmist grievance politics, picking on marginalized or vulnerable groups, isn't real, and it's not really popular, and it's not sort of targeting something that's real that's going to help make people's lives better. So in the medium run, there might be some controversy that might make companies nervous or something like that. They want to shy away from attention. But even in the medium run, not even that long run, those things will probably go away because society is changing and society is becoming more inclusive. Society is becoming more accepting of the recognition of new groups in the public sphere. And people aren't panicked about it the way that Republicans are trying to drum up this panic.
Yeah.
Like actual average people aren't that panicked about it. So it's important for sort of everybody involved, everybody who wants to be around for more than the next couple of years, just thinking about the long run, to be sort of to treat this moment with equanimity, to not panic, to stand by your values, to stand by your workforce, to stand by your employees, in order to navigate the social change that's going to happen, whether Republicans have hearings or not.
Yeah, I mean, it
How
seems
can
like
I just add
Republicans
something
are-
really
Oh, yeah, of
quickly?
course. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Because
Yeah, of course.
Tom brought up something that I think, bears fleshing out, and it's Virginia. And so we have someone like Governor Youngkin who comes in, with his little sweater vest, and he seems moderate, but he's actually part of, a faction that is quite dangerous, that is essentially hijacked the entire Republican Party. And so that's where we are. But we know that this is a person who has a pretty solid NRA rating. And so he spent a lot of time talking about CRT, creating this nonsensical hotline that no one called because it was a non-issue. It was just an election issue to sort of get the most, sort of fear-based people, what W.B. Du Bois would call, the wages of whiteness. So this, I'm the hero and the victim of my own story. But he did ignore gun control, as do most Republicans. This is when we think about Lee Zeldin running for governor of New York. Everything was crime, crime, crime. I mean, you would think that it was like a Law and Order episode, but no solution to crime, right? And so we know that crime is also a proxy for race in a lot of ways. It's a proxy for immigration. So instead of saying Black people, you're saying crime. Instead of saying immigrants, you're saying crime. So, some people are immune to it, some people are not. But I think what's really important when we think about not just DEI work, but also the economic ramifications of this, it's like, if we don't get gun control under control, then the costs, to say nothing of what it means for society, I mean, the mental health costs of young people sort of dealing with going to school, having drills on a monthly basis. But it's, when you think about a place like Virginia that just suffered a horrific loss at UVA. I mean, 3 students killed, 2 very severely injured, and also another student who will be going to prison for the rest of his life. So thus far, 4 lives gone. And governors, Republican governors, who refuse to have a conversation about gun control. So we think about Uvalde, that county voted for Governor Abbott. No solution for gun control, right? We still know that after Sandy Hook, when there was no conversation, we Democrats knew, people who care about movement in the society, as Tom mentioned, we knew that if it was young, middle-class white children and we didn't have movement on gun control then, we weren't going to see it anytime soon. And sadly, we were all correct. But I think when we sort of zoom out and think about the economic costs, but also the cost to our society, if we don't get that issue under control, there are going to be businesses that don't want to come to this country, external businesses. Already anecdotally, my friends who have, kids who live abroad, who usually come to the United States to do the high school exchange because they did it in the 80s and 90s. And it was a great experience to come from Paris or Germany or wherever you're coming from to live with a family in the United States. They're not letting their kids do that program, so it's like, will we see numbers of international students saying it's too dangerous to come to the United States to actually study and to live because you all don't have your gun control situation under any sort of control. So I think that that's also something that we need to consider because it's not just a city problem. We've seen it in cities, suburbs, and rural areas. And we know that guns are the leading cause of death for, white men and white people of a particular age. And so until we take that seriously, I don't know where we go in a conversation with the Republican Party.
Well, what about Dobbs, Sophia? You stressed Dobbs. I mean, if you're a corporate leader, the referenda did really well, for protecting abortion rights, right? And so if you're someone that's straddling the fence on how to respond, is there clear evidence in how the referenda protecting abortion access in states like Michigan and other places, are those sending clear signals to leaders in our society? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we're facing in this country, and this election doesn't erase, for example, as everyone's saying, it doesn't erase the polarization that there is in this country, the sort of resistance on working on very serious issues that are facing people and actually offering a vision and a plan to address those problems, to improve people's lives. I think, anti-choice politics has been a way to mobilize conservative voters. There was a concerted effort over decades from which to, change who was appointed to the judiciary to enact specific types of restrictions on abortion. And when that was fully materialized through the Hobbs decision, it is unclear to me that the GOP was prepared for the fallout of how unpopular those policies are. I think it should not surprise us that in very strongly Democratic states, there was support for a referendum that enshrines a right to abortion. I think what is a really interesting data point, though, is to look at conservative states that are red states, thinking here about like Montana or Kentucky, that rejected these proposals to restrict abortion into their constitution. That tells us that, again, and we've had this public opinion data for a long time, the extremist position to make abortion illegal has not been supported in public opinion broadly, ever, essentially, like in terms of the modern era of polling. There are segments of the population who believe very strongly in that position. It is not wide swaths of the public. It's not even the majority of the Republican base. This is just very unpopular. So I think that like corporations, political leaders, they're safe in taking positions where they say, no way, that's way too extreme. No, we don't want federal anti-abortion legislation. That would be a terrible idea. I don't think that that's really, dangerous. I think for specific members of Congress that are in really red districts that are very conservative, it could be. But at kind of the broad-based level for the party or for corporations, I don't think it is. But I think we have to be realistic that while there was some evidence that there was repudiation of extremism across a variety of policies, it is still popular amongst a couple segments of the population, these ideas, which means that when you're doing DEI work in corporations or in different organizations, there will be backlash by some people. I do not think in a world in which we are operating, in which there is white supremacy, there is not going to be backlash to these initiatives. And there will be organizations and people who work together who will not only target those types of programs, they will target those policies, they will try to mobilize people on the basis of generating these non-issues, as Tom and Christina have talked about. And there will be some backlash. That doesn't mean, though, that corporations should give into that, because I think we do have evidence that many segments of the public don't want these policies and they don't want environments that are this hostile, right? And so what this means, I think, when we're thinking about corporations is they should continue to invest and invest more in creating workplaces that are welcoming and inclusive, not just because it's morally the right thing to do, but because we have a lot of evidence it's what people actually want, especially when you're thinking about new workers who are youth, who are much more likely to hold these opinions. But I also think it's important to create opportunities for people to learn more, right? I say this frequently when I talk on this issue, is that a lot of people actually don't have a lot of knowledge on these issues, and they need spaces to learn, to sometimes mess up in learning, figure out how to actually adjust what their thinking is, but also, frankly, to counter some of the tremendous misinformation that is going on all these issues, that we really have to figure out how to tackle that. And I do think that's a problem that everybody has to figure out, not just political parties, not just activists, not just the media, but also corporations, institutions, higher ed. This is a major issue, is misinformation that is targeted towards drumming up threat narratives is one of the major issues facing both the formation of political opinions, but then subsequently political behavior. So we all have to address that.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great bridge to the final question, which is, well, so the way that I interpret the results is that even without everyone showing up, and even without, as Christina pointed out, the Democrats messaging effectively toward a Jedi agenda, where people showed up, it's very clear that young voters are breaking in the direction of supporting a Jedi agenda. And that's before we even get to big problems that haunt us all, like gun violence that Christina raised, which you can imagine would even draw in more people and unify more people around that, right? And so, but the reason that that's not translating into political impact or electoral impact is because of the gerrymanders, right? And the way that the institutions are set up. But that can only hold for so long. I mean, as the Gen Zers age into participation, I think that even that will be difficult to maintain. And so if corporations are in the business of understanding future segments, growth, if we take a market model, it's clear that the market from this election is tipping toward Jedi work, right? But the dilemma for corporations often is that the leaders at the top have already made commitments to politicians or institutions that are less certain about Jedi work, right? And so here we're speaking to mostly DEI leads, like what do we want corporations to do with this new information that, here in an election where the anti-woke forces were supposed to win and take over everything didn't happen, and that the coalition seems to be much more supportive of Jedi as principles. What are corporations supposed to do with that? So Sophia, you're saying invest in training and creating spaces where we can really get people to be better citizens. Okay. What are some other things, Christina, Tom, other things that we might ask corporations to do?
I think the work of our colleague Doreen Warren, I think the work of our colleague Megan Ming Francis, I mean, both of them have sort of written about, corporations who do good, do better. They make more money. Like, if we're going to keep it 100, it's like, if corporations are in business to make money, then the ones who are actually good to the environment, the ones who are actually good to their employees, the ones who are actually like creating a product that actually means something, of value to their consumers, they do better. Like the bottom line is better. And so I think that there's this tension because there are some corporations where the person or the board at the very top is super MAGA, right? And they are about profits and themselves, and they don't really care about who's picking the vegetables or who's sewing the clothes or who's doing whatever. But when you start trickling down, it's like those other employees do care and the consumers care. So like, if you want to have a sustained strategy, it's like, you know what? After you have $1 billion, you won capitalism. You don't need any more money. Like, we get it. Like, it's like, let's not turn into King Midas over here. I think that, that's against the American ethos, but I think, the level of greed in this country is a little insane. But we also we have no scarce resources. We shouldn't, but we keep telling ourselves that we do. It's like, no, we just don't share. We don't actually share profits the way we should. So, when we have these kind of quasi-artificial recessions and depressions, it's because people are hoarding, right? Reagan, we saw trickle-down economics doesn't work. I don't know how many times we have to bear that out. It doesn't work. So, but when you actually do create a social safety net for a community where people can make a living wage, we see literally people are healthier, right? Because of the stresses and strains. We see that crime goes down. Like, if we actually, when we have the data and the small samples where we invest in education and a robust way of creating a society, everything flourishes. Literally everything grows from the ground, trees included. So it's not just young people. And I think, the Gen Zers see that and they see the possibility of that. But I don't know if there's a real investment. Like, they're participating despite people not talking to them. And that goes across Democrats and Republicans, right? Because with the incumbency advantage, a lot of folks don't want too many Max Frosts coming through. Someone who is just like, I'm not wealthy and I came and I have ideas and I know how to work hard and mobilize people. We see the way AOC is treated within her own party, to say nothing of the horrid ways that Republicans treat her. But there's a level of disrespect because it's like she's talking crazy talk about a Green New Deal, about an environment, as Tom mentioned, we want to be around more than 5 to 6 years. So I think, from a dollars and cents point of view, it makes sense to make sure that you have a product and a company and a corporation that actually is robust. Because what we're seeing, I just saw a news story about Kentucky starting to unionize. We see the professors and staff and graduate students in California unionizing. I think, we're about to go back to a point where people are like, enough is enough. You can't work me into the ground, where we're seeing people with obscene profits. And it's just not trickling down to the rest of society. And so if we want safe streets, if we want good schools, we actually have to pay for it. And this idea of a tax code for rich people, isn't going to help the average American.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Al. I mean, this is a really important big picture question for our audience and for America generally. One way I tend to think about the current moment that we're in, and when I say moment, maybe it's a whole generation long, maybe it's 20 years, it's hard to tell. There's lots of different people, different actors working on different timelines. So like the Gen Z workforce has like their next year, their next month, they're trying to make rent, but they also have their whole career ahead of them and they're trying to figure out what their life is going to look like. Corporations have their quarterly statements to make, and they need to make sure that they're kind of pleasing stakeholders. But they also have, corporations are persons, but they're the kind of persons that don't have to die. They can go on and on and on forever as long as they adapt to new conditions. A century ago, the leading horse dealer in New York probably thought he was going to be like Henry Ford, but it turns out we didn't use horses very much longer. So being able to adapt to social change is so crucial in being able to build out that capacity, especially when you're a big organization who wants to sort of stay durable if you're not trying to sell out in the next couple of years. And so one of the ways I think about this is that there's a moment when a society or an organization is undergoing cultural change, especially when we're moving from something like homogeneity and a lack of diversity, sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of model, to a more diverse workforce, a more diverse electorate, a more diverse society, where different kinds of people are bringing different backgrounds, different experiences, different expertises, different skills. It's going to be a little friction as you make that transition. And then in order to manage all those sort of different perspectives, it requires investment in order to do that. But it should be seen as an investment, not as sort of a luxury good or something you're using to paper over and avoid conflict, something that you can use to manage change in these kinds of things. And so if we move through this period, one of the sort of I'm a political scientist and study urban politics. If you look below the national level, you can see times in American history where places like Chicago went through these sort of very divided, very tumultuous, very sort of chaotic moments of change, especially the 1980s in Chicago when Harold Washington, our first Black mayor, was elected. And the white machine that had been in power for 70 years completely revolted. They tried to basically shut down city government for 5 years. They really did kind of the same kind of pattern that that we kind of saw under Trump when the Republicans and Mitch McConnell trying to shut down government. But after you get through that period, it's just like the political system kind of catches up with society, and they're like, oh yeah, we're a diverse city. We're Chicago. We don't have to be a white supremacist city. We're Chicago. And we're able to get things done again after that kind of period of tumult. And the forces of reaction are no longer relevant. You can see this in California too, where California Republicans were in power in the 90s. There were a lot of social kind of ballot measures around immigration and restricting resources to new Americans in California. Those were successful in the 90s, those ballot measures. But 10 years later, Republicans in California are completely irrelevant in the public conversation. They're an extreme Republican party, but they have no power in governing that society. So the idea is that hopefully we're kind of moving through a moment of chaos. It feels very fraught, but if we can navigate these waters and get to another moment where we can successfully manage change in a multiracial democracy, and that'll help create stability in the conditions for corporations and other businesses to sort of be successful, to make long-term plans and not feel this sort of chaos and have to respond to every new headline by every sort of arbitrary ruling or statement by a leader.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really great point to underscore. And I think it's one that Christina and Sophia made, is that sort of a thriving multiracial democracy is really good for business in ways that the kind of the artificial creation of racial tension and sort of, bias against LGBT communities that's nobody wants that. And I think that's one thing that the election showed, is that, whether the Democrats were able to get a House seat or not, the vote broke in ways that shows that no one really wants, even if it's by a small margin, this kind of enmity, right? And I think that's really important. Why don't we open up for questions from the audience? If anyone wants to drop a question in the chat, please do. Until that happens, I'm going to go with some more focused questions for our panelists. And Sophia, I'm going to come back to you. We heard ad nauseum in the weeks leading up to the election about the conservative Latino vote and conservative Latino communities? What happened?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I just want to add one more point back to the corporation thing before I come to it. It's just that I think if we're talking about internally what corporations can do, they should not make assumptions about how their workers feel on these issues. They really need to do regular assessments that is not just climate surveys, but focus groups. And that's not actually just of workers of color or young people. They need to do it of all different groups, including groups who may be hostile. You cannot target policies and figure out how to address things within your organization if you don't know where things are actually at. And it's really important to actually do that. And sometimes that might be facing ugly things that you learn about your culture within your institution. But the only way to figure out any problems is to first actually identify them. And the only way to get to any solutions or trying different solutions is to know what you're trying to tackle and then adjust, try things. And if they don't work, figure something else out. And this is not, again, like a Band-Aid one time. On the Latino conservatism, I talked a lot about this in 2020. I thought 2020 was an outlier for a bunch of reasons because of the pandemic, how GOTV by Democrats was really affected by the pandemic in terms of way less in-person GOTV happened. And we know that for Latinos in particular, that was a highly effective mode of mobilization. So I thought part of what we observed in terms of who voted in 2020, who was Latino, was a weird sample that didn't actually represent what was the typical Latino electorate. And I think that, like, again, going back to geography, we had a couple of places where it was really different. Now, zooming forward to 2022, what we come away with is actually the message we've been saying, for like 40 years studying Latino politics, which is that Florida is an outlier. Florida has traditionally been an outlier amongst Latinos. We cannot generalize from Florida Latinos to the national public. We have typically talked about it as a conservative Cuban population. Now we have to kind of add to that to say, yes, and there's also now some South American groups, in particular, Colombians and Venezuelans, who are very strongly conservative and are voting Republican in South Florida. That is absolutely true. And if we look at some of the data from BSP on Latino South Floridian voters, they look like literally complete outliers compared to Latino voters in every other place, different subgroups in terms of different nationalities. And I think that, sometimes we let this narrative go crazy that this is a thing, but we have generally said that about 2/3 Latinos vote for the Democratic Party and about 1/3 vote for Republicans. There was never a time in which all Latinos voted for Democrats. I know that some people want to say that that has been true. It has not been true. The highest numbers we got to was 70-72%, depending on which data you're looking at. That is still very far off from all Latinos and is not very far off from 1/3. It's still very early, as Tom said, in terms of the data. So right now, the best data that we have looks like about 2/3, 1/3. Again, pretty much tracks with the trends that we've had. Florida, again, looks like an outlier. We did not see the same things happen in South Texas that happened in 2020. In fact, we had conservative Latina candidates who lost in South Texas. We had Democratic Latino members reelected or won. So I think that we need to be cautious. I will say, though, that, it is important for us to think about there isn't one Latino vote, right? There are different segments of the Latino electorate. There are important subgroup differences, regional differences, and increasingly what will be something that Latino politics scholars and pundits have to look at is the increasing number of evangelicals, because evangelicals relative to all other religious identified groups are much more likely to vote for Republicans and identify as conservative. If you have a greater number of Latinos who are now no longer identifying as Latino Catholics and identify as Latino evangelicals, not surprisingly, they're much more likely to vote Republican. The other big issue is misinformation in Spanish language media. There's a lot of research that indicates that some of the checks that we do on fact checking, et cetera, in media sources they are just literally, that system is not as robust in other languages that are not English. And so when there is tremendous amount of Spanish language media consumption by some segments of the Latino electorate, and then there's a lot of misinformation, and in particular, I'm thinking here on YouTube, that is really popular among certain segments of the Latino population, this is then influencing political behavior and attitudes in ways in which some really false ideas, like the Democrats are socialists, they're also, it's socialism, it's going to take over, it's kind of threat narrative on this, that then people in focus groups are saying that's what they voted based on, but then they voted based on essentially misinformation. So I think that these are all different things that I wish were talked about more in this sort of media narrative, but the kind of one sentence takeaway is Florida's an outlier. And we're seeing what we always see, about 2/3 Latinos vote for the Democrats and 1/3 vote for Republicans.
So Christina, you said that Black women are these canaries in the coal mine for the nation, and you noted their overperformance. What are sort of Black communities to take away from these results, where we still have a situation where, yes, Dobbs drove a lot of people to the polls, a lot of women of color to the polls. We still don't have secure ballots in a lot of these communities. Voter suppression is still happening. We all heard the week before the elections what was happening in the cases about both the Voting Rights Act and also affirmative action. Like the last 2 years have been all about corporate racial equity. Like, what is going to be possible in this space going forward, in your view, and what should we take away from the fact that the margins are so thin? like you pointed, like what does that mean for the future of the corporate racial equity movement? Oh, I think you're muted, friend.
It's only been 2 years. It's a real prisoner's dilemma, because Black women know the capacity of this country, and so we know all the promises the corporations made. Remember the Black Square? Right? We've seen, Penn State promising to hire all these different people, and now they're shutting down full programs. That's just one example that I'm calling out, but it's widespread. Corporations sort of were like in the moment, and Black people know that was like temporary, it was fleeting, and they just didn't, I think June 2020, there were a lot of corporations that actually were like, did we push Black people to the limit? Like, are they actually going to burn down this country? There's always been that fear of Black people are going to burn down this country. It's like, we're not going to burn down the country. We built the country. We uphold the country. We literally keep saving the country from herself. So it's like there was a fear corporate wise that, maybe we overplayed this hand. And so there were these gestures, and now the gestures have been rolled back. So I think that's the curse of sort of being in a party. The Republican Party has chosen their lot with white nationalism. So, in ways that they could actually clean up with Black voters, especially immigrant Black voters. Wrote a book called Black Ethnics, right? Like the way they could clean up with conservative Black voters, they just choose not to because they are in a white nationalist space. So Black Americans are in a party, but our shades of blue within this party are very complicated and they're very diverse. And so Black women exponentially vote for the Democratic Party because that's the party that we think can get not just us, but everyone else closer to these ideals that Sophia, Tom, and I have laid out. The interesting piece is Black men are the second group. So no, they're not as strong as Black women, but we can't fall into the Killer Mike narrative, read a book, Killer Mike, where it's just like, actually Black men don't hate the Democratic Party. They might not be as, 95% entrenched, but they're 89%, 90% entrenched, right? So they're still the second most strong voters. And then it's Latinos, right? And the diversity therein. So like, we have to understand that Black folks understand this country, but we also have to go to the polls because we understand white people. We understand class, we understand race, we understand ethnicity better than most of the people who are going to the polls. And so we oftentimes will sacrifice our first choice for maybe a second choice that gets us closer to the ideals and values that we want. So, yes, there are progressive Black people. Not all Black people are progressives by any stretch of the imagination, but the conversation about Bernie Sanders, and he did so poorly among Black people, that made total sense to scholars of Black politics because Black people understand white people will never vote for Bernie Sanders for a host of reasons. So you go with your second or your third choice. might I add, Bernie Sanders, go to South Carolina and shake hands with James Clyburn. Maybe you'll get a few more votes. But that's neither here nor there. That's a 2020 conversation. So when it comes to corporations, though, we have to understand that oftentimes Black voters will sacrifice their first choice for something that moves not just them, but the larger project forward. And so the diversity within the Black community is robust and it's there, it's just trapped within one party. So we can't make the assumption that all Black people are the same ideologically. It's just partisan wise, we happen to be in a very complicated space in one party.
No, I hear that, Chris, and I think it's a very profound analysis, but I want to push back gently just a little bit. So, I mean, on this call, and Tom and I, the work that we do, and I know you know a lot of these folks too, there are lots of leaders of color and progressive white leaders in corporations that put a lot of skin in the game to get these billions of dollars in commitments against the tide, perhaps, of what their boards wanted, maybe what their CEOs wanted. And so, you know, they're sincere in wanting to, you know, sort of push the corporate racial equity narrative. But with the politics so fraught, what advice would you give to these people, right? I mean, I you know, like Bank of America, the $2 billion, I mean, there are a lot of Black leaders behind that. They partner with CSDD. And so like, they're true believers. Like what can they take from this election up or to their horizontal affiliates who may not be as strongly supportive, that they can keep these programs sort of thriving and in the right direction, right?
Because I would say, gently pushing back,
okay,
that it can't be an election season. I think it needs to be a building of the pipeline also. So like, are we investing in not just HBCUs and Black students who are in HWCUs, but are we in communities where predatory lending of, listen, I've been hostage at Bank of America since 1996 when they were Bay Bank and I was in Boston. So it's like, what about the predatory lending that these banks still do in Black communities, right? Or the difficulties in bank fees that Black people have. We know Wells Fargo is notorious, right? When we think about the ways that Black people are disproportionately appraised or lack thereof through these banking systems. So it's like, so then let's do a full excavation. Let's start cleaning house in all the different ways that like banking structures are holding Black people back. I'm just using Black people as an example, but all these other corporations, you may have someone at the top who in their heart of hearts feels it, but what are you doing with the entire culture? Because when we go through the halls of a lot of these institutions, whether it's banking or foundations or whatever the corporations are, it's like, there is not just a glass ceiling, there's some ceilings where the C-suite looks a certain way, the board looks a certain way. You know, you might have workers, but are they in leadership and management positions other than, you know, how many times do I get asked to take a picture to like be the face of something? And it's like, really? Because you need me to be the face of something. But if you had a real like diverse cadre of employees or leaders in a company. So I don't think it's enough to just like, let's hire some people, but like, are we really trying to change the structure and the culture? Because don't forget that lots of people got hired post 2020, but did they stay? Because are these corporations really invested in changing the culture? And there are a lot of people who do DEI work. And let's be honest, like it's a hustle for some places, like it's a scam. So like, are people really invested in changing the culture? And I don't know if all these corporations are really invested in changing the culture. They're invested in like getting the heat off of their backs and saying, we've got X% of people of color, we got X% of women. But like, are you really trying to like cultivate a real relationship so that they stay and they feel as though they have input and can actually contribute as equal members in the corporation?
I think we have to leave that as the last word or question. So I just want to thank our panelists, Christina Greer, Tom Ogorzalek, and Sophia Wallace for joining us. And let's keep counting votes, as Tom said. Let's get the data, as Christina and Sophia echoed, and try to really understand what happened in this election. But thank you for giving us a great start.